On my 30th birthday, my father raised a glass to the whole table and announced I wasn't his daughter. 40 people heard him say it. My mother didn't correct him. My sister smiled into her wine. And me, I just sat there with a slice of cake I no longer wanted, feeling the room rearrange itself around a story that wasn't true. So I ordered a DNA test. I wanted proof. What I got back destroyed everything my father believed, just not in the way anyone expected. My name is Mallory Hayes, and I've spent 30 years being the daughter my family forgot to see. The birthday humiliation wasn't an isolated moment. It was the loudest in a long line of quiet cruelties I'd learned to absorb. My mother's silence at that dinner table told me more than any words could. She'd known this accusation was coming. Maybe she'd even helped prepare the stage. But the DNA test I ordered the next morning held a truth none of them expected. The question wasn't just whether my father was wrong. The question was what he'd been hiding all along. And the answer would rewrite everything I thought I knew about my family. But to understand why those words landed like a knife, you have to go back to the beginning. I grew up in a house where love was measured in ounces, and my sister always got the full cup. Our home in a quiet Denver suburb looked perfect from the street. Neat lawn, white shutters, a swing set in the backyard that my father built himself. But inside, there was a ledger I didn't know I was being kept on until I was old enough to read the numbers. From as early as I can remember, my sister Olivia was the project. She was the one my mother dressed in matching bows and dresses for school pictures. She was the one my father took to weekend softball games, sitting in the front row with a video camera. I was the one who learned to tie my own shoes because no one had time to bend down. When I was 8, I won the school's spelling bee. I brought home the blue ribbon, held it up in the kitchen. My father glanced at it over his newspaper and said, "That's nice, honey. Make sure you hang it somewhere your sister won't knock it down." Olivia was 7 and had just spilled juice on the carpet. The carpet got more attention than my ribbon. That was the pattern. Small erasures stacked so high they became a wall I couldn't see over. By the time I was 12, I had stopped bringing home achievements. I didn't bother showing them my report cards. I knew the response, a distracted nod, a quick change of subject to whatever Olivia was doing. She was the artist, the dancer, the one with potential. I was the one who was independent, the one who didn't need much. They said it like it was a compliment. I learned to hear the truth underneath. Things got worse in high school. Olivia got a car on her 16th birthday, a used Honda, but still. I got a bus pass and a talk about responsibility. She got a new wardrobe for homecoming. I got a hand-me-down dress from a cousin. When I asked for help with college application fees, my father sat me down and explained that they had already set aside money for Olivia's future and that I should look into scholarships. "You're smart," he said. "You'll figure it out." I did figure it out. I worked 2 jobs throughout high school, saved every dollar, and earned a partial academic scholarship to a state university. They came to my high school graduation, but sat in the back row and left early because Olivia had a dance recital. In college, I barely survived. I worked 3 jobs, lived on ramen, and slept 4 hours a night. My parents called occasionally, but only to ask if I could send money home for Olivia's new hobby or to complain about how expensive her private lessons were. I never told them about the nights I cried in the library bathroom. I never told them about the time my roommate found me eating a packet of crackers because I couldn't afford a meal. They didn't ask, and I had learned not to expect. After graduation, I built a career in marketing. It took years of grinding, of taking jobs no one else wanted, of saying yes to every extra project. By the time I turned 29, I was a senior account manager at a respected firm. I had my own apartment, a reliable car, and a savings account. I had done it all without them, but they never saw it that way. To them, I was still the girl who didn't need much, the one who was fine on her own, the one who could be overlooked. My 30th birthday was supposed to be a simple dinner at my parents' house. I didn't want a party, but my mother insisted. She said it was important for the family to celebrate together. I should have known better. When I arrived, the house was full. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family, friends, 40 people. The dining table was set with my mother's good china, and a cake sat in the center with candles already lit. Everyone sang. I smiled. I made a wish. I blew out the candles. And then my father stood up, glass in hand, and the room went quiet. "I have an announcement," he said, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Since we're all here, I think it's time Mallory knows the truth." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "You're not my daughter." The words hit like a slap. I heard gasps. My mother's face went pale. My sister looked down at her plate. The room started buzzing with whispers. I sat frozen, the taste of birthday cake still in my mouth as my father continued, his voice almost cheerful. Your mother and I were never married when you were conceived. I always had my doubts. And now, with you turning 30, I think you deserve to know the truth. He smiled. Not a kind smile, a victorious one. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just looked at my mother who wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at my sister who was pretending to study her napkin. I looked back at my father who was waiting for me to shatter. And in that moment, something clicked. He wasn't telling me the truth. He was trying to hurt me. He was trying to take away the last thing I had, my sense of belonging. But I had spent 30 years learning how to survive without his approval. I had spent 30 years building a life he knew nothing about. So I did the only thing that made sense. I ordered a DNA test. The kit arrived 2 days later. I swabbed my cheek, sealed the envelope, and mailed it off. And then I waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day I replayed his words. Every night I wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe I really was the daughter of some stranger, abandoned by a mother who couldn't tell the truth. I called my mother, finally demanding answers. She broke down crying, but she didn't deny it. She said she was sorry. She said she had made mistakes. She said she had always loved me. But she didn't tell me who my real father was. The results arrived 6 weeks later. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. And what I read inside did not just prove my father wrong. It unraveled everything. It turned out the truth was far stranger, far more devastating, and far more personal than any of us had ever imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what the DNA test revealed, I need to tell you about the one person who knew the truth all along. The one person my father never expected to step forward. The one person my father never expected to step forward was the one person who knew him better than anyone, his own sister, Deborah. She called me 3 days after I opened the DNA results, my phone buzzing with a number I hadn't seen in years. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. Mallory, she said, her voice low and careful. I need to talk to you. Alone, no family. Can you meet me tomorrow? I agreed. We met at a diner halfway between my apartment and her town. She looked older than I remembered, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the room before she sat down. She didn't order coffee. She just reached into her purse and pulled out a folded envelope, faded yellow, with my father's name written in my grandmother's handwriting. Your father didn't know I had this, she said, sliding it across the table. I found it after Mom died. I've been carrying it for 12 years, waiting for the right moment. I think that moment is now. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, dated 44 years ago, addressed to my grandparents from a hospital in Denver. The words blurred as I read them. It was a birth certificate amendment, signed by my grandfather, officially acknowledging my father as his son. But the original birth certificate, attached beneath, listed a different man as the father. A man whose name I didn't recognize. Deborah watched me read. Your father was born to a woman who wasn't his mother, she said quietly. My mother, your grandmother, was infertile. She and Dad adopted him privately from a young waitress who couldn't keep him. They never told him the truth. They were afraid it would break him. My mind raced. My father, the man who stood at that birthday dinner and declared I wasn't his daughter, had spent his entire life believing he was a biological member of a family that wasn't his by blood. The DNA test I had taken confirmed he was my biological father, but it also revealed something else. The genetic markers in his DNA matched a distant relative on my mother's side, which made no sense unless there was a hidden connection between our families. And now, with this letter, the pieces started clicking into place. Deborah leaned forward. The woman who gave birth to your father, she was your maternal grandfather's sister. Do you understand what that means? Your father is your mother's first cousin. They never knew. They were never told. That's why the DNA test flagged a familial match that shouldn't have existed. The room swayed. My father had called me a stranger, a child of another man, but the truth was far more twisted. He and my mother were blood relatives, unknowingly. The man he had accused of being my real father didn't exist. He had publicly humiliated me based on a lie he didn't even know he was living himself. The irony was devastating. I sat in that diner booth for a long time, letting the truth settle. My father's entire identity, his sense of superiority, his pride in being the real parent, it was all built on a foundation of secrets he hadn't been told. He had spent 30 years treating me like an outsider, only to discover that I was more connected to him by blood than he ever could have imagined. But worse, he had done it while hiding a secret of his own, one that would shatter his sense of self. I asked Deborah why she was telling me now. She looked down at the table. Because I saw the video of the birthday dinner. Someone filmed it and sent it around the family. I saw the way he looked at you. I saw the way you held yourself together. And I decided I couldn't let him destroy you with a lie when I had the truth in my hands. That night, I called my mother. She answered on the first ring, her voice shaky. I told her I knew about the adoption. She was silent for a long time. Then she confessed. She had known my father was adopted. My grandmother had told her in confidence before they got married, but my father never knew and she had been too afraid to tell him. She also confessed that she and my father were distantly related, something she discovered only after my birth when a routine genetic screening flagged a blood type anomaly. She had buried it, hoping it would never surface. She was crying by the end. "I'm so sorry, Mallory. I should have told you. I should have protected you from all of this." But the damage was done. The question now was, did my father know any of this? Deborah believed he didn't. My mother wasn't sure. And I had a choice. Confront him with the truth or let him go on living in a bubble of false certainty. I chose the confrontation. 2 weeks later, I showed up at my parents' house unannounced. I brought the letter, the DNA report, and a recording of my conversation with Deborah. I found my father in the garage, tinkering with his car like nothing had happened. He glanced up when he saw me, and his face hardened. "What do you want?" he said. I set the documents on his workbench. "I want you to read these, and then I want you to explain why you thought you had the right to humiliate me when you've been hiding a truth far worse than anything you accused me of." He picked up the papers, frowning. As he read, I watched the color drain from his face. His hands started shaking. He read the letter twice, then looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before, pure, unguarded shock. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "From your sister," I said, "the one who actually knows the meaning of family." He sank onto a stool, the papers crumpling in his grip. "I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking. "I swear to God I didn't know." "But you were so quick to accuse me of not being yours," I said. "You didn't need proof to tear me down. You just needed an excuse to push me away. And now you know what it feels like to have your entire identity ripped out from under you." He didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at the floor, a man who had built his life on secrets he never knew were buried beneath him. And in that moment, I realized that the DNA test had done more than clear my name. It had exposed the fragile foundation of the person who had spent 3 decades making me feel like I didn't belong. But the story wasn't over yet, because there was one more person who needed to hear the truth. Someone who had been used as a weapon against me my entire life. My sister, Olivia. And she was about to learn that the favoritism she had enjoyed was built on a lie too. Olivia had been the golden child for 30 years. She was about to learn that her throne was built on a foundation of secrets too. I found her at her boutique, the one our father had funded with money he'd said didn't exist for my college applications. She was arranging a display of handbags, her movements precise and practiced, the same way she had always arranged her life around being the center of attention. She looked up when I walked in and her smile froze. "Mallory, what are you doing here?" I didn't bother with small talk. I told her everything. The DNA test, the letter from Aunt Deborah, the adoption, the fact that our parents were cousins, the fact that her entire identity as the real daughter was a carefully constructed illusion she had never been invited to see behind. She laughed at first, a nervous, brittle sound. "You're lying. You're just trying to get back at me for Dad's birthday stunt." "I have the documents," I said. "I have a recorded confession from Aunt Deborah. I have Mom's admission. You can keep laughing, but the truth isn't going to change because you don't like it." She stopped laughing. Her hands dropped from the handbags, and she stood there perfectly still as the color left her face. "You're serious?" I've never been more serious in my life. She sat down on a stool behind the counter, her legs giving out. She stared at the floor for a long time. Then she looked up at me and her eyes were wet. I always wondered why Dad was so obsessed with making sure I was perfect, why he pushed me so hard, why he couldn't stand the thought of me failing. I thought it was love, but it was fear. He was afraid that if I wasn't perfect, someone would find out he wasn't perfect either. I didn't say anything. I let her sit with that. She started talking then, words tumbling out like a confession she had been holding for years. Do you remember when we were kids and he would take me to all those competitions? He never asked if I wanted to go. He just put me in the car and drove. And if I came in second, he wouldn't talk to me for a week. I thought I was the lucky one, but I was just the one he needed to prop him up. You got to be invisible. I got to be a puppet. I sat down across from her. For the first time in our lives, we were having a real conversation. Not about who got what, but about what we had both lost. Mom knew too, Olivia said quietly. She knew about the adoption. She knew about the blood relation. Did she ever tell you why she stayed with him? No. Because she was afraid of what he would do if he found out the truth. She thought if he knew he was adopted, he would fall apart. And she thought if he knew they were related, he would leave her. So she kept quiet. She let him treat you like an outsider because it was easier than telling him the truth about himself. The weight of that sentence hung in the air between us. Our mother had sacrificed me on the altar of my father's ignorance. She had watched him humiliate me for 30 years, and she had said nothing, because protecting his fragile sense of self was more important than protecting her own daughter. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, something colder, a final severing. Olivia wiped her eyes. What are you going to do? I already did it, I said. I confronted him, he knows now, and he's going to have to live with it. She nodded slowly. He called me last night. He sounded different, broken. He asked me if I still loved him. I didn't know what to say. What did you say? I said I needed time to think. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out a folder. Before you go, there's something you should see. Dad gave me this about a year ago. He said it was our family tree, going back 4 generations. He was so proud of it. He had it commissioned by a genealogist. She handed it to me. I opened the folder and scanned the document. My eyes caught on a name near the top, the same name from the original birth certificate, the man who was my father's biological father. But the family tree didn't stop there. The genealogist had traced the line further back, and what I saw made my blood run cold. My father's biological father was the brother of my maternal great-grandmother. That meant my father and mother were not just first cousins. They were closer. They were the product of 2 families that had been intermarrying for generations, a closed loop of blood that no one had ever bothered to map. And it got worse. The genealogist had noted a cluster of genetic disorders common in closed populations, recessive conditions that only appear when both parents carry the same defective gene. I recognized one of them. It was the same condition my sister had been diagnosed with as a child, the one that made her fragile and special and worthy of all my parents' attention. They had never told me it was genetic. They had never told me it was caused by the very thing they were hiding. Olivia saw my face change. What is it? I showed her the notation. She read it, then looked up at me, her expression unreadable. All those years of being the sick one, all those years of being the favorite because I needed extra care. I thought it was random. I thought it was bad luck, but it was their fault. It was the incest. The word hung in the air like a grenade. Not incest, I said quietly. Not intentional, but the result is the same. They inherited a time bomb and they passed it down to you. Olivia closed the folder. Does Dad know about this part? I don't think so. The genealogist might have mentioned it, but Dad would have ignored anything that didn't fit his story. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something like respect in her eyes. You didn't have to tell me any of this. You could have let me stay in the dark. Why didn't you? Because I spent 30 years being treated like I didn't deserve the truth. I'm not going to do that to someone else. She nodded slowly. What happens now? Now we decide whether we keep carrying their secrets or we put them down. Over the next 3 weeks, everything unraveled. My mother admitted everything to the extended family. There were phone calls, angry emails, a cascade of recriminations. My father went into hiding, refusing to speak to anyone except his sister. The family tree was shared among relatives, and the truth about the generations of hidden connections spread like wildfire. Olivia and I started meeting regularly. We didn't become best friends overnight, but we started talking about our childhoods from the other side of the fence. She told me about the pressure she felt to be perfect. I told her about the loneliness of being invisible. We began to see that we had both been damaged by the same people, just in different ways. And then, a month after the DNA results, my father called me. His voice was hollow, stripped of the arrogance I had known my whole life. "I need to see you," he said. "I need to apologize in person." I agreed to meet him at the same diner where Aunt Deborah had handed me the letter. He looked smaller than I remembered, older. His hands shook as he lifted his coffee cup. He didn't meet my eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not enough, but I need to say it. I was wrong about everything. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about myself. I spent my whole life pretending I was something I wasn't, and I took it out on you because you reminded me of the parts of myself I couldn't face." He paused, struggling. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be better." I looked at him, this broken man who had once held so much power over me, and I realized that the DNA test had done more than prove my parentage. It had freed me from needing anything from him ever again. Not his approval, not his apology, not his love. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, "but I've already moved on. I don't need you to validate my existence anymore. I've been doing that myself for 30 years. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know, you're stronger than I ever was." We sat in silence for a long time, and then I stood up, left a tip on the table, and walked out. I didn't look back. Because the real payoff wasn't his apology. It was the life I had already built without him. It was the sister I was finally getting to know. It was the freedom of knowing that the DNA test didn't just tell me who my father was. It told me who I was not. I was not his victim anymore. Walking out of that diner, I thought the story was over. I was wrong. The DNA test had one more secret left to reveal. 3 weeks after my father's apology, I received a letter from the genealogist who had created the family tree for him. She had heard through family channels about the revelations, and she felt obligated to share something she had discovered but never included in her report. I opened the envelope in my kitchen, a gray Tuesday morning with rain against the windows. Inside was a single page, typed, with a handwritten note at the bottom. The genealogist explained that while building my father's tree, she had found an anomaly. A DNA sample submitted to a public database from a woman in her 90s living in a nursing home in New Mexico matched a branch of our family with 99.9% certainty. The woman's name was Alina. And according to the records, she was the biological mother of the child my grandparents adopted. My father's biological mother. The waitress who gave him up 44 years ago was still alive. I sat down hard on the kitchen floor, the letter shaking in my hands. My father had spent his entire life believing his birth mother was a stranger who walked away. But the genealogist's note suggested something else. Alina had been trying to find him for decades. She had registered with multiple reunion registries, filed inquiries with the adoption agency, even hired a private investigator. But my grandparents had sealed the records. My father's adopted name was never connected to his birth name. She had been searching for a ghost. I stared at the name, Alina, my biological grandmother, the woman who had never stopped looking for the son she lost. I made a decision within 30 seconds. I booked a flight to Albuquerque. The nursing home was a modest facility on the outskirts of the city desert landscape stretching out behind it, dry and endless. I checked in at the front desk, gave Alina's name, and was led to a small sunroom with plastic-covered furniture and a television playing a game show with the sound off. She was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, a thin blanket over her legs, her white hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her eyes were closed, but she opened them when I sat down across from her. Her gaze was sharp, undimmed by age. "You have his eyes," she said. "My son's eyes. I've seen photos of him from the family that raised him. You must be his daughter." I nodded, my throat tight. "I'm Mallory. I'm your granddaughter." She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were papery, but her grip was strong. "I've been waiting for someone to find me for 30 years. I thought I would die without ever knowing if he knew the truth." I told her everything. The birthday dinner, the DNA test, the revelations about the adoption, the hidden blood relation between my parents. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from sorrow to something like grim satisfaction. "I knew his adoptive parents," she said when I finished. "They were good people. They loved him, but they were afraid. They thought if he knew he was adopted, he would feel like he didn't belong, so they buried the truth, and they never told me where he ended up." She paused, looking out the window at the desert. "I was 17 when I had him. My family sent me away to have the baby in secret. I held him for 1 hour, then they took him. I never got to see him again. I never got to tell him I loved him." I squeezed her hand. "He's still alive. He lives in Colorado. He has a wife, a daughter, a house. He owns a business. He's not the man you would have hoped for, if I'm being honest. He made a lot of mistakes, but he's still your son, and he just found out about the adoption. He's broken right now." Aliner's eyes filled with tears. "Do you think he would want to see me?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think he deserves the chance to decide." I called my father that night from my hotel room. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. I told him about Aliner. I told him she was alive, that she had been looking for him his entire life, that she had never stopped loving the son she held for 1 hour. He was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Where is she?" he finally asked, his voice raw. I told him. The next morning, he flew to Albuquerque. I stayed in the background while they met. It wasn't my reunion to claim, but I watched from the doorway of the sunroom as my father walked in, saw the woman in the wheelchair, and stopped. He didn't say anything at first. He just crossed the room, sat down beside her, and took her hand. Aliner started crying. He started crying. They sat like that for a long time, two strangers bound by blood and loss and 60 years of silence. My father didn't become a different person overnight. He was still the man who had humiliated me at my 30th birthday. He was still the man who had favored my sister and ignored me. But I watched something shift in him that day. The armor cracked. The certainty crumbled. He was no longer the man who had to be right about everything because he was terrified of being wrong about himself. When he came out of the sunroom, his eyes were red. He stopped in front of me and said, "I spent 60 years not knowing the most basic truth about myself, and I took that anger out on you. I'm sorry. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you." I didn't tell him I forgave him. I wasn't sure I did. But I told him I was glad he got to meet his mother. That was true. I flew home the next day, and something strange happened after that. The family started to call, not to apologize exactly, but to check in. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me, asking if I was okay. Aunts and uncles who had sided with my father for decades started reaching out to say they believed me, that they had always suspected something was wrong. The story had spread, and with it, the truth about the family tree. People were angry at my parents, but they were also asking questions about their own histories. Olivia and I started having dinner together every Sunday. We didn't talk about the past at first. We talked about our jobs, our friends, our lives. But gradually, we started to talk about our childhood. I told her about the bus stop and the spelling bee and the nights I cried alone. She told me about the pressure to perform, the fear of failure, the loneliness of being the favorite. We realized we had both been prisoners in the same house, just in different cells. About a month after the reunion with Aliner, my mother called. She had left my father. She was staying with a friend across town. She said she had finally accepted that she had enabled his behavior for 3 decades, and she was done. She asked if I would be willing to meet her for coffee. I said yes. We met at a cafe near my apartment. She looked tired but determined. She apologized without excuses for the first time in her life. She didn't blame my father. She didn't say she was trying her best. She simply acknowledged what she had done. She had let me be sacrificed to protect a man who didn't deserve protecting. She said she understood if I never forgave her. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for a chance to earn my trust, one small act at a time. I told her I would think about it. I'm still thinking. The final surprising detail came 6 months later. I was going through my father's old records, helping my Aunt Deborah organize family documents, when I found a letter tucked inside the original adoption papers. It was from my grandmother, the woman who had adopted my father, written to Alina shortly after the adoption was finalized. The letter had never been sent. It was a draft, in my grandmother's handwriting, full of crossing outs and second thoughts. The letter read, "I know you will always be his mother in your heart. I promise you I will raise him to be a good man. I will tell him about you when he is old enough to understand. I will not let him forget where he came from." My grandmother had never kept that promise. She had sealed the truth away, and my father had grown up believing a fiction that nearly destroyed him. My mother had known and stayed silent. My father had clung to his own false story so tightly that he had torn apart his family to protect it. I closed the letter and put it back in the file. That promise broken, that silence kept, was a chain linking 3 generations. But I was not going to be the next link. I had the truth, and I had the choice to use it differently. So this is what I chose. I called Olivia. I told her about the letter. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "We should tell Dad not to hurt him, because he deserves to know the whole truth." We told him together, sitting in his living room, my mother's absence a heavy presence in the room. He listened, then nodded slowly. "I spent my whole life thinking I knew who I was," he said. "Turns out I didn't know anything, but I'm learning. I'm trying to learn." He looked at both of us. "I don't deserve daughters as patient as you two." We didn't argue with that. The DNA test arrived in a small envelope, 6 weeks after my father announced I wasn't his daughter. It didn't tell me who my biological father was, because he had been sitting across from me the whole time. What it told me was that my father's entire identity was a house of cards built on a foundation he had never been allowed to see. And when I smiled for the camera in that thumbnail, it wasn't because I was gloating. It was because I finally understood something he never had. The truth doesn't need vengeance. It just needs to be spoken. And once it is, the silence can't survive. I don't know if my father and I will ever have a normal relationship. I don't know if my mother's apology will lead to real change. I don't know if Olivia and I will stay close or drift apart again. But I know one thing for certain. I am no longer standing at anyone's bus stop, waiting for a ride I was never offered. I built my own car, and I decide who rides in it. That is the real payoff. Not revenge, not vindication, just the quiet freedom of knowing that I belong to myself. And that is worth more than any DNA test could ever prove. This story didn't end the way anyone expected. Not my father, who thought his accusation would finally break me. Not my mother, who believed silence could protect a fragile house of cards. And certainly not me, who ordered a DNA test expecting a simple yes or no, only to uncover a tangled history that had been hidden for 3 generations. But here is the thing about family secrets. They don't disappear just because you stop talking about them. They sit under the surface, shaping every decision, every favoritism, every wound. And eventually, they find a way to be heard. The only question is whether they come out in a moment of truth or a moment of destruction. My father chose destruction. He chose humiliation. But the truth rose anyway. It always does. What I learned from this is not that DNA defines who we are. It doesn't. My father was raised by loving parents who happened to keep a terrible secret. My mother was trapped by fear and tradition. My sister was a pawn in a game she never agreed to play. And I was the scapegoat, the one who could be sacrificed to maintain the fiction that everything was fine. But fictions collapse. And when they do, you get to decide what you build in their place. I chose honesty. I chose to tell my sister the truth, even when it hurt her. I chose to confront my mother, not with anger, but with a demand for accountability. I chose to let my father meet his biological mother, because I believed that everyone deserves to know where they come from, even if the knowledge shatters them. And I chose to stop waiting for an apology that would fix the past, because nothing fixes the past. You only get to decide how the story continues from this moment forward. My father is still learning how to be a different man. My mother is still figuring out who she is outside of his shadow. My sister and I are still building a relationship that was never allowed to exist. And I am still me, independent, self-sufficient, and finally at peace with the person I became without their help. If this story reached you on a day when you are questioning your own worth, doubting whether you matter because someone made you feel small, I want you to hear this. You are not the version of yourself that someone else created in their mind. You are the version you are building with your own choices. And that version is enough. It always was. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about family, truth, and the courage to walk your own road. Leave a comment telling me what you would have done if you were sitting at that birthday table. I read every single one. My name is Mallory Hayes, and this is the day I stopped being the daughter they forgot and started being the woman I chose to become.